They believed surviving the camp was the hardest part of the war. But what if the fences were never the real prison? And what if the moment the gates opened was the moment something far more dangerous began to happen inside their minds? What happens when men endure captivity, adapt to it, survive it day after day, only to realize that everything they learned to survive is useless once the waiting ends? And what if freedom did not heal them at all, but instead exposed a damage the camp had quietly prepared, long before anyone noticed it was too late? At first, survival inside the camp demanded attention, calculation, and constant awareness, because nothing felt predictable and every small decision carried weight far beyond its size. The men learned quickly that the camp did not crush them through violence alone, but through repetition, through days that resembled one another closely enough to blur into a single continuous experience. Hunger arrived at the same hours, work followed familiar paths, and nights settled into the same silence, broken only by distant sounds that gradually lost their meaning. Over time, fear stopped arriving in sharp waves and instead settled into something quieter and more manageable, because uncertainty is easier to endure when it becomes familiar. The prisoners adapted not because they were strong in the heroic sense, but because adaptation required less energy than resistance, and conserving energy became the most important skill of all. Survival slowly shifted from an active struggle into a practiced routine, one that no longer required constant thought. The camp did not change much during this period, yet the men inside it did, because they began to measure time differently, not by dates or weeks, but by repeated actions that filled the day without asking questions. Morning counts, work details, meals, and sleep arranged themselves into a rhythm that felt strangely stable, even when it was uncomfortable. Stability, however fragile, carried its own form of relief, and that relief quietly reshaped how captivity was experienced. As days passed, the idea of endurance replaced the idea of escape, not because escape was impossible, but because imagining it required energy that survival no longer allowed. Planning demanded belief in a future that could be influenced, and influence felt distant inside a system that rewarded predictability above all else. The men learned what was expected of them, and in learning that, they reduced the number of surprises in their lives. This reduction mattered more than they realized at the time, because surprise was exhausting and exhaustion was dangerous. The camp taught them that emotional restraint was safer than hope, and that expectations created vulnerability. By lowering expectations, they protected themselves from disappointment, and in doing so, they unknowingly accepted a narrower version of life that felt easier to manage. The absence of constant danger created an unusual mental space where alertness softened into watchfulness, and watchfulness eventually faded into habit. Guards became part of the background rather than a source of daily tension. Rules became familiar landmarks rather than threats, and even confinement itself lost some of its emotional sharpness. This was not peace, but resembled calm closely enough to be mistaken for it. In this environment, survival stopped feeling temporary and began to feel sustainable, which altered the prisoner's relationship with time. Waiting no longer felt like a pause between events, but like the main condition of existence. The future receded quietly while the present expanded, filling every mental space with tasks that required no reflection and offered no direction beyond completion. The men did not discuss these changes openly, because nothing dramatic seemed to be happening and nothing dramatic felt necessary. They were alive, they were functioning, and each day resembled the one before it closely enough to suggest that this state could continue indefinitely. That assumption, though rarely spoken, shaped their behavior more than any order ever could. What none of them could see yet was that this adaptation, which made survival possible inside the camp, was also teaching them something dangerous, something that would matter far more once the routines disappeared. The camp had not only taught them how to endure confinement, but how to live without expectation, without initiative, and without urgency. And long before freedom arrived, the conditions were already forming that would make freedom harder to face than captivity itself. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the routines settled deeper into daily life, control inside the camp required less effort than anyone expected because the men had already learned how to regulate themselves. Orders no longer needed to be enforced loudly, and punishment no longer needed to be visible, since most behavior now followed patterns that felt safer than deviation. The structure of the camp had moved inward, becoming something the prisoners carried with them rather than something imposed from outside. The men woke when they were expected to wake, moved when they were expected to move, and waited when waiting was required. Not because they were being watched constantly, but because uncertainty had become more uncomfortable than obedience. Predictability offered protection, and protection was valued more than autonomy in an environment where mistakes carried invisible costs. Over time, following the routine felt less like submission and more like self-preservation. This internalization of control altered how authority was perceived because guards were no longer the primary source of regulation. Instead, the boundaries of acceptable behavior were enforced quietly through habit, through shared understanding, and through the subtle pressure of conformity. Standing out became undesirable, not because it was forbidden, but because it disrupted the fragile balance that made daily life manageable. The camp did not need to remove choices entirely, because the men had already learned to avoid making them. Choosing required mental effort, and effort reminded them of loss, responsibility, and uncertainty. By limiting their own decisions, they reduced emotional strain, and in doing so, they unknowingly surrendered parts of themselves that had once defined who they were before captivity. Silence played a central role in this transformation because it filled the spaces where questions might have formed. Conversations became practical rather than reflective, focused on tasks, schedules, and immediate concerns rather than meaning or direction. Speaking less felt safer, and listening without responding became a learned skill that minimized risk and preserved energy. Gradually, the absence of resistance was mistaken for acceptance, and acceptance was mistaken for peace. The men were no longer fighting the system, but they were also no longer measuring themselves against anything outside it. The camp had become the reference point by which normalcy was judged, and anything beyond its boundaries felt abstract and distant. This shift did not happen suddenly, nor did it feel alarming at the time, because nothing was being taken away abruptly. Instead, initiative faded quietly, replaced by compliance that felt voluntary. The men still thought of themselves as individuals, yet their actions increasingly reflected a collective rhythm that discouraged deviation and rewarded predictability. What made this stage particularly dangerous was how functional it appeared, because the prisoners were calm, cooperative, and stable. From the outside, it might have looked like order had been restored, but internally, something essential was being suspended. The ability to act without instruction, to imagine alternatives, and to tolerate uncertainty was slowly weakening. The camp no longer needed walls to confine the men completely, because the habits formed within those walls were now strong enough to shape behavior on their own. Control had shifted from physical boundaries to psychological ones, and those boundaries were far harder to recognize, let alone resist. This was the moment when survival stopped being about enduring captivity and began shaping how life itself would be approached afterward. because the skills that kept them safe inside the camp were quietly preparing them for a future where freedom would feel unfamiliar and even threatening. And while nothing had changed visibly, the conditions were now set for a realization that would arrive only when the routines finally disappeared. As control became internal and routines required little thought, the men gradually noticed that acting on their own no longer felt natural, because initiative had slowly lost its place in daily life. Decisions that once seemed ordinary now felt unnecessary, and unnecessary effort felt risky in a system that had taught them that stability came from predictability rather than choice. Inside the camp, waiting had always been safer than acting, because waiting reduced exposure and limited consequences. Over time, this lesson settled deeply, shaping behavior even when no direct instruction was present. The men learned to pause before moving, to hesitate before speaking, and to observe before responding, because hesitation had become a form of protection. What they did not realize was how thoroughly this habit had reshaped their sense of agency, because initiative requires confidence in outcomes, and outcomes inside the camp had never been clear. By avoiding initiative, they avoided disappointment, conflict, and emotional strain, but they also surrendered the instinct to direct their own lives. Daily tasks no longer invited thought beyond completion, and completion itself became the goal rather than a step towards something larger. The men moved through their responsibilities efficiently, but without intention, because intention implied a future that felt unreachable. Life narrowed into manageable segments that required presence, but not purpose. This narrowing created a strange sense of calm, because fewer expectations meant fewer emotional risks. The men were no longer preparing for change, because preparation implied belief that change would arrive. Instead, they adjusted themselves to continuity, learning to exist comfortably within repetition. Conversations reflected this shift, becoming shorter and more functional, focused on what needed to be done rather than what might come next. Discussions about the future faded naturally, not because hope had been crushed dramatically, but because it no longer seemed relevant to survival. Hope required momentum, and momentum had been replaced by endurance. As initiative disappeared, responsibility followed, because responsibility assumes the ability to influence outcomes. Without that belief, actions became reactive rather than intentional, shaped by circumstance rather than choice. The men did not feel powerless in a dramatic sense, but they felt neutral, suspended in a state where effort and reward were no longer clearly connected. This neutrality made the days easier to endure, but it also made change harder to imagine. The men had learned how to function without direction, and functioning without direction gradually became their default state. Even when small opportunities arose to alter routine, they were often ignored, not out of fear, but out of habit. The camp no longer demanded obedience actively, because obedience had been replaced by passivity that felt self-chosen. This passivity did not feel like defeat, because defeat implies loss, and nothing tangible had been taken away. Instead, it felt like simplification, a reduction of complexity that made daily life easier to navigate. What the men could not yet see was that this simplification came at a cost that would only become visible later, when choices returned and direction was expected. The skills that had protected them inside the camp were quietly eroding the very instincts required to function outside it. And as initiative faded without notice, the conditions were forming for a future where freedom would arrive suddenly, demanding decisions from men who had learned to survive by avoiding them. The idea of release had always existed somewhere in the distance, mentioned occasionally, but never examined closely, because examining it required imagination, and imagination had slowly gone quiet inside the camp. Freedom was treated less like an approaching reality and more like an abstract concept that did not demand preparation or emotional investment. As rumors of change began to circulate more clearly, the men did not respond with excitement, because excitement requires expectation, and expectation had long been set aside as a liability. Instead, the possibility of leaving introduced an unfamiliar tension, one that disrupted the internal balance they had learned to maintain. The routines that had once provided stability suddenly felt fragile, as if they might be taken away before replacements were ready. What unsettled them most was not the prospect of departure, but the absence of structure beyond it. Inside the camp, days were shaped by predictable demands, but outside, nothing promised to guide behavior in the same way. Freedom appeared vast, undefined, and emotionally unmarked, offering choices without instruction and responsibility without boundaries. The men realized that they had learned how to exist within limitation, but not how to navigate openness. Inside the camp, decisions had been minimized, and now the expectation to decide again felt heavy rather than liberating. The future, once ignored for survival's sake, now returned abruptly, demanding attention without offering clarity. Some men found themselves delaying emotionally, avoiding thoughts of departure as if postponement might preserve the fragile equilibrium they had built. The camp, for all its constraints, had become familiar territory, and familiarity carried a sense of safety that uncertainty could not match. Leaving meant abandoning not just confinement, but also the habits that had made daily life manageable. Conversations reflected this unease, as talk of home lacked detail and certainty, filled instead with generalities that avoided commitment. Plans remained vague, not because the men lacked desire, but because desire felt risky after so long without agency. Hope, once quieted, did not return easily. The realization emerged slowly that freedom would require a different kind of strength than captivity had demanded. Endurance would no longer be enough, and obedience would no longer provide guidance. Initiative, which had faded quietly over time, would now be expected without warning. This expectation created a subtle fear that did not resemble the fear of punishment or violence, but rather the fear of being unprepared. The men sensed that the skills they had refined so carefully inside the camp might not translate to life beyond it. What had once protected them now threatened to leave them exposed. As the idea of release became more real, the camp began to feel less like a place of confinement and more like a structure that had shaped them deeply. The walls had not only contained their bodies, but had also organized their thoughts, their timing, and their sense of control. By the end of this phase, freedom no longer appeared as a simple return to life, but as a disruptive force that threatened to undo the fragile stability they had built. The men were beginning to understand that surviving the camp had been possible precisely because of its limits, and that stepping beyond those limits would require confronting parts of themselves that had been quiet for far too long. By the time departure was no longer theoretical, the men had already changed in ways that could not be reversed by movement alone, because the camp had quietly become the framework through which they understood stability, safety, and control. What they had learned there was not how to endure suffering, but how to function without direction, without choice, and without expectation, and that knowledge now followed them toward the outside world. Inside the camp, life had been narrow but coherent, shaped by routines that required little interpretation and offered clear limits. Outside, life promised no such clarity, replacing structure with possibility and routine with uncertainty. The men began to sense that the camp had spared them from the burden of deciding who to be, and that leaving meant carrying that burden again without preparation. The realization arrived slowly that freedom did not erase the habits formed under confinement, because habits do not dissolve when circumstances change. The reflex to wait, to hesitate, and to avoid initiative remained intact, even as the context shifted. What had once been adaptive now fell out of place, creating a dissonance that could not be resolved quickly. The men understood then that the camp had not been the hardest part of their experience, because within it, expectations were limited and responsibility was suspended. Survival had required endurance, not reinvention. The greater challenge lay ahead, where endurance alone would no longer suffice, and where the absence of structure demanded decisions that felt foreign and exhausting. This understanding did not arrive with despair, but with a quiet heaviness, as the men recognized the depth of what had been altered. The camp had taught them how to exist within constraint, but it had not taught them how to reclaim agency once constraint was removed. Freedom now required rebuilding instincts that had been deliberately quieted for survival's sake. The hardest realization was not that the camp had changed them, but that it had changed them effectively. It had provided a way to live that minimized emotional risk, and leaving meant re-entering a world where risk was unavoidable. The discipline that had once protected them now limited them, and the calm that had sustained them now felt insufficient. As the moment of departure approached, the men were not overwhelmed by fear, but by the weight of unstructured possibility. The camp had offered answers through routine, while freedom offered questions without guidance. In that contrast, the truth became clear that the camp had been survivable precisely because it reduced life to something manageable. And so they understood, often without saying it aloud, that the camp had been the easy part, not because it was humane or gentle, but because it had removed the need to choose, to imagine, and to direct oneself, leaving behind a version of survival that ended the moment freedom demanded more than endurance. When the gates finally opened, nothing dramatic happened, because the real change had already taken place long before. The camp did not end in a single moment, nor did its influence disappear with distance. As the habits learned inside, it continued quietly, shaping thought and behavior without needing walls to survive. What remained was not the memory of confinement, but the absence of structure that confinement had once provided. Freedom arrived without instructions, and life resumed without the routines that had made endurance possible. In that space, the men discovered that surviving captivity had been simpler than learning how to live again. And so the camp faded into the past, but its lessons lingered, leaving behind a silence where choices waited, and where the hardest part of the journey began only after survival was no longer required. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.